Okay, well, I'll get started and I'll let more people in as they arrive. I'm Justine Roberts. I work for the Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility at the Leeds School of Business. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today. Thank you for joining us. This is the second panel in a three-part series on workforce and current events that we're offering. And today's topic is about how companies are using CSR to manage immediate needs within their companies and their workforce, and also to plan ahead, or in some cases not, for the future of work. We're really excited to have four incredible speakers with us today, and they will introduce themselves directly in a minute. Cory Cunningham, Demesha Hill, Merna Jacobsen, and Rachel Mountin. A couple of small housekeeping items. Because there are four speakers, we suggest using speaker view so you can see who's talking, and you should all be muted throughout the event, please. It's about 60 minutes long, so we do have some prepared questions and facilitated discussion that I will be leading. If you do have a question, put it in the chat, and please put it in at any point. If it's relevant and I can bring it up, I will just fold it right into the conversation, and of course, let everyone know who's asking the question. And anything we don't get to, I will try to make 15 minutes at the end to ask additional questions that are in the chat. Before we begin, I want to recognize that our program today is located on the traditional territories of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute peoples. In addition, 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. And lastly, a note on today's topic, which is that when we first began planning this event, we were coping with the pandemic. Since then, there have been other issues that have emerged for our communities, most significantly the national conversation around the urgent movement for racial justice and social justice. And so that will also be part of today's discussion because it affects all of us and it affects our work. So with that, I would like to have our amazing panelists each introduce themselves. And Merna, if you could go first. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much and welcome to everyone. I think I work here at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I think I must have the longest title on campus. So I will try to do it all in one breath. I'm an Associate Vice Chancellor, Deputy Chief Human Resources Officer, and Director of Employee and Organization Development. If I oversee a number of areas here at the university, I oversee organization development, which means I spend a lot of time helping people focus on what they should be thinking about. I also oversee employee learning. I oversee programs focused on the psychologically healthy organization, and I also address comprehensive onboarding of new employees. So if I had to say what I'm about, it's really about, I'm one of the experience makers, I think, for the organization.
Terrific. And
Hi, I'm Demesha Hill, and I work at Janus, Henderson Investors. I'm the head of diversity and community relations. I'm also the managing director of the Janus Henderson Foundation. So Marnie has me beat with the longest title, but mine is pretty long. If I had to kind of sum up my role, I feel like I'm one, a culture carrier, one, engaging employees in the community, as well as looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion through a global lens.
Hi, I'm Cory Cunningham. I teach in the Leeds School of Business, and I study risk and crisis communication. And so what I'm most interested in is, number one, how do companies go about preparing for, which is the most overlooked part of crisis stuff, is the pre-crisis. It's not as sexy, but it is hugely important. And so I'm really focused on that planning piece of it and helping organizations with their crisis communication plan, but also inter-organization. So how do different organizations and entities in one community, how do they work together before a crisis, during a crisis, and after a crisis? And I am so excited to be here because I think having this conversation couched within sustainability is crucial for the success of organizations going forward. So I'm very glad to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Mountin. I lead social responsibility efforts at Davita, probably the shortest title of our panel here. I'm also a Leeds MBA alum, class of 2013, so go Buffs. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to share some of my experience with Davita. Just a quick overview of what Davita is if you're not familiar. It's a Fortune 200 healthcare company headquartered in Denver. We're one of the largest providers of kidney care services in the US, and we have about 2,700 outpatient dialysis centers across the country. And we are also in 10 countries worldwide. So as I mentioned, I lead our social responsibility efforts. And within our team, that includes environmental sustainability, some of our teammate or employee engagement programs, as well as our charitable giving and community engagement. So excited to share a little bit more about how we have been responding to some unprecedented, challenging times.
Thank you all. So I wanted to start by putting this in the context of the Business Roundtable, which last summer updated their statement of purpose to focus more on stakeholder capitalism and moving away from a center around shareholders. But that was before the pandemic, and it was before the racial justice, recent racial justice movement. And I'm curious about how companies are responding to current emergencies in ways that are in line with creating value for their employees and their customers. So Demesha, I was hoping that you could kind of start us off by talking about Janus Henderson and how things are different in the last 4 months than maybe they were a year ago.
Yeah, I think from a stakeholder standpoint and trying to ensure that you add value, I mean, that hasn't changed. We're still looking at ways in which we can connect with our clients, connect with our employees, connect with our shareholders. But the way that we're connecting is a lot different now. I think one of the most important things was for us to create some sense of normalcy when everything was kind of shut down. And unfortunately, the markets were tanking, and that's our business. We needed to be sure that we could actually have a way for our clients to connect with us and talk to us. So it was really important that we really moved swiftly and made sure that all of our infrastructures were in place for us to work remotely. I think one of the unique things about this is that we had a little bit of a practice run with it because our employees that were based in the Asia Pacific region had already went through a similar lockdown a couple of months prior before it really hit the India market and the North America market. And so we had some things that we could kind of leverage to make sure that we did this successfully if 95% of our employees were going to be working remotely. But then the other thing we really thought about too as an organization was working from home is not ideal for everyone. Some people don't necessarily have the setup and the equipment to do that. So we had to look at things from a human capital lens and make sure that we provided employees the resources that they needed, whether that was an extra monitor or an ergonomic desk or an ergonomic chair. So what we ended up doing was providing employees a stipend for them to actually go out and get what they needed in order for them to continue to fulfill the needs of the business. And then the other thing that we had noticed as we kind of went into like week 2 and 3 of the lockdown, our employees were getting a little antsy. And so that's when we really leveraged our volunteer program to create an additional outlet for our employees. So we did a lot of virtual volunteering. We reached out to some of our community partners to really figure out what is it that you need right now to kind of help support you in connection with COVID. We moved very quickly to provide the resources for the various regions in which we were kind of operating in. And then we also started to realize that we needed to evaluate our policies from a human capital standpoint, because people were working 12 hours a day and people were not taking vacation like they needed to. And so we made sure that our executive team sent out strong communication that we still want you to take a break. We don't want you to burn yourself out. We stress the importance of just mental health and providing employees resources around mental health, because that's a lot of anxiety that our employees were actually kind of taking on during this unique kind of time in our world. So we really emphasize the mental health piece. So not only fulfilling the needs of our clients, but also looking at things from an employee standpoint and making sure that we were meeting them where they needed us to meet them at, and making sure that we could not just take a one-size-fits-all approach. Everyone needed something different, and we were just trying to make sure that we provided the resources to them that they needed.
So it sounds like a very human-centered strategy. And Rachel, I'm curious if Davita took a similar approach, or if there were different pieces that you guys are working with.
Yeah, thank you. Well, at Davita, we talk about our social responsibility from the lens of what we call our care. So caring for our patients, which is kind of the heart of what we do with dialysis services, caring for each other. So understanding that our teammates are pretty critical to that care piece, and then caring for our world. So how are we also, being good stewards of our resources and good global citizens. So global health pandemic, the caring for our patients, that sense of urgency just really shown there. And dialysis is a critical function. I mean, it was an essential service. Our patients need dialysis 3 times a week. And sometimes if they're treating in-center, that means coming to the dialysis center 3 times a week. So a huge emphasis was placed on patient safety, on teammate safety. And thankfully, these are things that, we're already good at, right? Like infection control policies and procedures were things that we had, since the start. And it's kind of heightening it. And how can we make sure that, when we did start to have COVID positive patients, we were treating them safe and caring for them in a really safe way. And so having cohorts of COVID positive patients to kind of limit the exposure to non-positive patients. The first thing is kind of all hands on deck in terms of we want to really make sure that our patients are being cared for well. And it was different in different places of the country, right? And so we also saw volunteers, volunteer nurses apply to New York because that's where more is needed. So we did have some teammates volunteering to help in that way. And we also, provided some additional patient education materials about safety. We provide our patients with cloth masks for when they're not in the center, and to help educate on how to keep themselves safe outside of the clinic. And then on the caring for each other side of things, similar to what Demesha shared, we saw our teammates were starting to burn out, especially those that were in the really intense parts of the country. And so to take a look, what are our teammates most need right now? And so that took many forms in terms of also some kind of pay and benefits and additional compensation, and providing free online counseling resources to teammates and their family members, and making sure they knew that was available. And then our internal communication team of not okay, it's okay. This is really hard, to make sure that people knew it was good and encouraged and healthy to reach out for support when they needed it. So that was one of the pieces that I really appreciated too. And I am one of the ones that office teammates of are working from home, and thankful that we are able to. And the bulk of our teammates are in those clinics, so in those patient-facing roles. And then the last thing I'll touch on is the caring for our response. And we looked at what the needs were in our different communities, and so decided to sponsor a couple different organizations as it relates to food security. So knowing that was an issue in communities everywhere, partnering with Feeding America, and then partnering with Food is Medicine Coalition. And that's a group of organizations around the country that provides meals oftentimes to homebound seniors. And that also kind of connects to our patient population. as well. Sometimes they're in that category as well. So really felt like, gosh, that is a need in the community. It relates to what we do. Those are the types of organizations that we want to partner with in this time, and then offered a matching program as well for any teammates who wanted to donate. So those were a couple of ways that, that we have responded and are continuing to do so.
Neat. I like the way that you think about the different constituents. And I saw Cory nodding throughout both of Demesha and Rachel talking about their company programs. Cory, from the point of view of crisis management, I'm curious, what it is that you're hearing that you think is really strong in these approaches that other companies can learn from and build on.
Yeah, I am nodding along as I'm hearing everything that both of y'all are saying, because it's exactly what industry leaders across the country are doing. And so organizations that are setting themselves up to view this horrific crisis as an opportunity to grow, to do better, to advance and take care of people, y'all are doing great. There's three things that I think high level that top companies are doing who are going to be really successful with this. They're providing transparency. And so this is frequent communication, but it needs to be personal. It's not good enough just to keep your different stakeholders up to date. That's important. But there needs to be a level of humanness in those messages. And if people feel like you're talking to them personally, they will listen all day long, and that's what you want. And so creating that personal but very clear transparency of what the company is doing and how you as a stakeholder in whichever category you fit in can still find value there. The second one is empathy. And both of these companies that we've heard from today already are doing a beautiful job with empathy. It's that this is horrible. This feels terrible. None of us are happy with this. We get that. We hear you. And just validating that. But also things like providing the mental health services. So many companies today, or even things like remote work or adjusting schedules, providing emergency child or elder care for your employees if and when they should need it. Providing masks, it's that caring piece. The third one is vision. And this I haven't heard as much, doesn't mean it's not there, but I think it's important to mention that effective leaders during crisis acknowledge that this is bad where we are, but at the exact same time, they are continuing to keep their eye on the long end goal, delayed gratification. Here's where we ultimately want to be. And so companies like Starbucks, for example, at the end of May, adjusted their vision statement to building a bridge to the future. And so you see Starbucks is still wanting to be a part of our future. They're updating their menus. They're putting more food out there. Their drive-thrus are still open. They want to be a part of the community. And so combining those three things, I think, is what's going to make the difference in terms of creating and maintaining that value.
So, Merna, in terms of how companies work with their both with their employees, their internal stakeholder groups, but also with communities. I mean, one of the things I'm hearing the other panelists say is that companies don't have necessarily all of the resources internally to do what needs to be done. They need to build partnerships and they need to identify who they can work with. I'm curious, what are you hearing from the point of view of that sort of collaboration that you think is important and that we should be keeping as a building block as we move forward into whatever the future looks like?
Yeah, certainly this pandemic doesn't recognize boundaries. So, this pandemic doesn't stop at the boundaries of whatever organization we're all part of leading. So, for example, here at the university, we have a very close connection with the city of Boulder, where we reside. They're very concerned about, how do we bring students back, and what is the impact going to be on the local citizens, and how are we managing behavior when we're trying to get voluntary compliance. I think a couple of things. One is that we're paying close attention and standing up temporary structures that are what I would call some customer experience management groups. So we have groups of people at the institution who are dedicated to our different, what we don't usually refer to them as customers, but the people we serve. We have folks who are focused entirely on the student experience. We have people who are focused on the faculty experience. We have people who are focused on the experience of our community stakeholders. And so being very intentional about managing the experiences of all of the people who are coming into contact with you as a result of this pandemic. So I think that, customer experience management teams is a great strategy to use to make sure that you're being very intentional about how you're managing this entire situation. One of the other things that I will just add to this, and I'll shift a little bit. You had mentioned, Justine, that we began with the COVID situation, but then, we had extraordinary events around Black Lives Matter and anti-racism. This is the moment when I think this is the leadership opportunity that organizations have to focus on what does it mean to be an anti-racist organization and to deal with anti-Black racism and systemic racism in our organizations. So one of the things that we have done is based some work on out of the literature on compassionate organizations that focused on collective noticing, collective feeling, and collective responding. And so we've set up listening groups and dialogue groups for our Black, African American, and African staff to be able to come together to talk about self-care, ongoing talks between those groups and our executive leaders about changes they would like to see, asking departments to come forward with noticing where within their systems and policies for whatever functional area they are in, are there elements of that are perpetuating systemic racism? This is a great opportunity to come forward with plans to address racism that is inherent in our systems, because we all know that it's there. This is the water we swim in, and we're not noticing it. So that first chunk of doing some collective noticing as an organization, and then be able to collectively respond to it to answer that question about what do we want to do to be an anti-racist organization, I think has been the other piece that we have been forwarding as part of our responsibility as an organization.
So a lot of what Merna you're talking about are new systems, new working groups, interdepartmental or interdisciplinary teams that maybe didn't exist before, new communication opportunities and channels that are being opened up within an organization, new processes and policies that are going to come out of those discussions. And that's a piece that I'm really curious about with the corporate social responsibility departments in general, because it seems to me that a lot of us believe that now more than ever, CSR has to be baked into the DNA of our organizations and has to be part of the conversation of the way forward. So Demesha and Rachel, for both of you, I'm curious about ways that you work now that are different today than they were. Some of the kinds of things that Merna's talking about, how does that showing up in your organizations? Does CSR have a seat at the table or have a voice on decision makings that you wouldn't have previously?
I would say that, the voice is just louder, that we have. I think that there is more and more questions that are coming our way from various parts of the business that truly are starting to understand the value that CSR actually brings to the table. Our clients want to know, what are we doing? How are we responding to the pandemic? And then most recently, how are we responding to the racial injustice that's happening around the world? And so I think what's happened now is there's more dialogue happening around it, and people are starting to understand that they were using a lot of words like equality and equity and diversity, all as kind of interchangeable words, and they didn't really understand the true definition. And so when they started hearing about systematic racism and what that means, and they were like, what really is that? They're starting to talk more about it. And I think having educational sessions around that has been really, really powerful for our employees, to let people share their lived experiences and how it shows up in their day-to-day lives. I feel like as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, I think we're in a unique situation because now we're more connected than ever to people on a personal level, because every single day, every hour, we are inviting people that we work with into our homes. We are inviting strangers into our homes. And so you're starting to see that human kind of connection between people. And folks are starting to realize that we're all in this together. And so I think the conversation from our perspective has been, allyship and what that really looks like. And so now we're saying, allies, it's no longer okay for you to stand on the sideline. You need to be on the front line. You need to use your privilege to really help those on the front line. And when you start to look at the various systems of oppression, you can see that every subgroup has some sort of privilege. And so how can we empower our employees to start to use that privilege to really make a difference? And so I think what's really happening is people are starting to think differently, and they're starting to look internally at even minor policies that they might have had in place or procedures that in some way could have created barriers to access an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
And Rachel, what's it like at Davita?
Yeah, thank you. And welcome to my home. Yes, it's been super interesting to have pandemic and then have racial injustice, and to be having conversations about systemic racism at work. These were things that had started, right? Like diversity, and we have a diversity and belonging team and executive panel. Like there are things that we were doing, and I would just say that recent events have just really accelerated those efforts and amplified too. And this is something that's super important to our senior leaders. They have committed to, and we serve all of our teammates, our employees, to help guide us in terms of, where do they think those resources should be allocated, both within Davita, for supporting our teammates, and within communities. And so using some of that data to help drive decisions, that kind of speaks to our democratic principle and philosophy as a company. And then, we strive to be a community first and a company second is the logo that is on our website. And I mean, if you want to live up to that, you have to have some of these really real conversations about, gosh, we have to take a hard look at what we're doing and make the changes that are necessary, and be open to that. And I feel like we're definitely having those conversations, and it's definitely elevated at a level that I haven't seen before. And so that gives me some hope. It's that, recognizing there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And gosh, I really do hope that this is an opportunity for us to use, the fact that we're having conversations with senior leaders on this, that our social responsibility team is partnering with our diversity and belonging team. And yes, those are different teams. And so how does that play? And how do we work together on the same goals? And so those are things for us that we're still working through. And I'm super thankful to say, you know, we have a scholarship program already set up. And so if we want to do a scholarship, a diversity scholarship of some sort, you know, we can work on those things. Like our team has some of the mechanisms in place. And I think this is a real opportunity for us that we're trying to use to say, all right, one, let's review what we're doing and make sure there are none of those unintended consequences, and make sure that that sort of continuous improvement is looped into our processes. And then two, how can we further our efforts in supporting racial justice? So that's sort of how we've been thinking about it, how we've been partnering, and it's absolutely a priority. It has been, and I would say this has just amplified the priority.
Cory, I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the short-term versus long-term perspectives that companies take. For a company that has not done the level of planning, doesn't have all the pieces in place that Janus, Henderson, and Davita have, and these are organizations that have been doing all of this work for a long time and are building on a lot of existing traditions and resources. For companies that are more responding in the moment, how do they balance the need to address immediate issues and the need to plan for the long term?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think the short answer is they adapt. But if I break that down a little bit more, these are companies who are, even if you haven't done all of the due diligence prior, you are here, we are, and now we have to deal with this. Things that are very small seemingly. So one thing that is happening is that in the wake of the pandemic, that decisions are being made and problems are being solved much more quickly. And companies are doing a really good job of like getting through all the the politics, the bureaucracy, the silos that we are so accustomed to having to deal with. In times of crisis, everybody goes, yeah, forget that. Let's just solve the problem. And so there is companies who are able to put aside those sort of luxury kind of aspects of an organization and get to what is the problem, how do we solve this. They are the ones who are seeing a difference. They are ones who, there's this saying right now, particularly in marketing, that is safety breeds loyalty. And so ideally you would have been working on loyalty and forming a relationship with your stakeholders well before now. But if you're starting from now, even it matters, just like what we've heard from our other panelists. It's so much what you do. They want to see the actions, not just lip service. So these companies who are even starting now, they're finding creative ways to bridge the online with the real experience. And so they're adapting, they're looking at pricing. And so it really is a matter of get out of your comfort zone and have your mind wide open as to how can we adjust and still be financially viable, but also taking care of our people. And they recognize that if they forget about the people part, they will not survive, period. Will not.
So, and then Merna, to you, I'm curious, to build on what Cory just said. She's talking a lot about the skill sets that companies need, right? The communications skills, but also the human resource management skills. And you talked earlier about the collaboration skills. So I just want to hear from you a little bit more on what it is you think that companies should focus on in terms of the skill sets that they need to be developing and investing in right now to be able to weather whatever this the timeline is around coming back to a more in-person, I refuse to say normal, a new normal, and whatever that looks like. What is resilience actually made up of? What do we need to be working on?
Yeah, I can address that. I think one of the answers lies in a great question that can be an exercise for any organization, which is to ask ourselves, who do we want to be, become, and be known for in this moment? And once that question is answered, then the next one is, so what is the mindset that our employees need to have and our leaders need to have in order to be that? You know, I think mindset has a great deal to do with your ability to be resilient, your ability to adapt, and this, which I think are going to be the survival skills of the moment. You know, the other thing in terms of skills that workforces need to have now, I think that there's a range. Certainly resiliency is one of them. But I also think the emerging technologies are going to continue to be part of our organization, and having been put in the virtual environment, think about the learning curve and how quickly everybody had to get up to speed on new technologies. I don't think that is going to change anytime soon. I think that's going to continue to be a need. I also think critical thinking skills. I think that, you know, we are moving out of that information age and into an age now where we're being faced with things like artificial intelligence and this overwhelming amount of technology. And do we have the critical thinking skills to evaluate what is really appropriate for us to invest in? What is the appropriate use of some of the information we have available to us, rather than just being consumers of information? How do we use information significantly or in significant ways? So the ability to be critical thinkers, I think more and more we are moving toward certainly more metacognitive skills for employees. That do employees understand their own thinking tendencies, abilities, capabilities, and how does that play in with self-learning? Because this will be part of what we're going to be moving people to, is more and more self-learning and being good consumers of their own learning agendas. And then, of course, being able to be in much more diverse organizations, defining diversity very broadly. And how do you collaborate and be present in a team that is very diverse, and how do you foster that kind of diverse thinking as a mechanism for ongoing innovation? I think that one of the ways to do that is by looking, you know, we've talked about looking at systems, and I think that both the social justice movement that we're seeing recently and the pandemic has caused us to look at all of the systems that by which our organizations operate, because if we're not doing systems thinking, I think we missed the boat. So this is a great time to do an examination, but there's two other layers. And I think one of those is about how do you do habit forming among the people in the organization? What are the habits? You know, that piece of what is it that we need to be doing seamlessly so that it's happening just almost unconsciously for us. We need to start building in habits to be examining, for example, systemic racism, or to be examining safety issues, or to be examining how we lead virtually. That needs to become habitual. And then the other thing is, this is a time for leaders to frame situations for others, to do sense making of the situation, to move away from urgency to looking for opportunity. And that means that it's all about making it a priority. So that three-legged stool of priorities, habits, and systems, I think, is a great way for leaders to begin thinking about, how do I need to approach my organization right now?
Cory, I know you think a lot about organizational priorities also. Do you want to pick up on what Merna was saying?
Yeah, this dovetails very, very nicely some of the things that I was thinking about in terms of shifting priorities beyond the policy bureaucracy stuff. And again, one of them is adapting and sustaining. And there's this great example, a company, Amul, I'm probably saying that wrong, but they're in India, and they are the largest dairy company in India. And when the pandemic hit and everybody went into quarantine, obviously people are cooking it from home. People like me who do not cook at all have to suddenly learn how to feed myself. So people in India who use these dairy products and are cooking at home, Amul decided they would put free cooking classes on Facebook, live cooking classes. And so it was a way for them to, very cheap, very easy, but a way for them to stay relevant, stay current on people's minds, still be in the mix of we're a household name, we're feeding you, that kind of thing, even in the midst of a pandemic. Decision making, as I said, and this need for expediency is also a huge priority. That one CEO said, I love this quotation, decision making excelled when we cut out the nonsense. We now make decisions in one meeting. There are never more than 9 people on any project, and they have entirely banned all PowerPoint. They're looking at quarterly is the new annual. So prioritizing, not only thinking about things in the long term, but also building in shorter term benchmarks. So assessing things on a quarterly basis rather than an annual basis, which leads then to more flexibility in your ability to adapt much more readily. And then finally, the priority that all lives have value. And that can take form in a lot of ways. For example, Ally Financial, they have given $1,200 to all of their employees who make less than $100,000 a year, and this $1,200 is tax-free financial aid. They are doing free telemedicine consults. So prioritizing not just the sustainability and adapting to stay relevant, but also how do we make decisions? How do we solve problems quickly? And the human aspect of it all, and really valuing the mental, emotional, and physical aspects of all human lives.
So,
I'm sorry, I'll just add a couple of other things that I think that can build on what Cory just said. I think the idea of building in safety nets for employees, I think all 4 of us have talked about that. One of them that I think organizations need to think about is thinking about the difference between furloughing employees and laying off employees. Those are 2 different things. And like for us, we have option to furlough if we can, and not lay off if we don't have to. That builds in a safety net. We also started an emergency fund for people whose spouses had lost the job, or their partner had lost a job, or they were being furloughed from the university, or that kind of thing. They could apply for emergency funds, and we've given out several $100,000 worth of emergency funds to tide people over. But I also think that a couple of other skills that I think leaders are going to need at this time. One is how to conduct postmortems on the fly. We're in this state of really accelerated decision making, and we, in a non-COVID situation, we have the luxury of standing something up and then doing a postmortem to say, how did that work and what can we learn from it? Now we're having to do them continuously because things are evolving so quickly. And I think that skill of learning how to learn from what you're doing well and what you're not doing well has to happen very, very quickly so that you can continuously improve. And having those, it's not really legitimate to call them postmortems because they're not a postmortem. We're not at the end, we're in the middle. But using that strategy to continuously learn as an organization on the fly, I think is essential. And there are skills associated with that, and there are formulas associated with that. And I think that introducing that, looking for what we can do better without placing blame, I think is the key. The other thing is that we're standing up a lot of temporary structures right now in organizations. And what that says to me is that leaders are going to be managing a lot of transitions. The COVID situation is going to transition from one phase to another phase, possibly another phase. We don't know what those are going to look like, but being able to manage transition periods, I think, is essential for leaders, and knowing the strategies that are going to be most essential for managing those transition periods, I think is key to leadership right now.
So, Rachel, I was what I'm going to ask you actually was really connected to what Merna was saying, particularly at the end, which is there's a lot that we have to do in the moment now. And I'm curious to what extent you believe that the kinds of ways in which Davita is responding to these multiple crises are intended to be long-term and are thinking ahead and anticipating long-term impacts on overall diversity in the workforce, for instance, or other ways in which we need to plan ahead, versus really being in the moment. And related to that, I'm still really interested in having you articulate where CSR, where your department is in these conversations, so that people understand the extent to which, you know, it's the culture of Davita to do this anyway, or your department is really helping drive or shape the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I think when the pandemic started, we and probably many others kind of viewed it as a short-term crisis and almost treated it like a natural disaster. And so we kind of went into that playbook, like, all right, we can open up our what we call Davita Village Network. And so that's that additional employee assistance type of funding for people who are impacted by COVID. And then thinking through, oh gosh, we have a budget for that, and this could be really big. And so how do you set those kind of tiers of support, not with so much uncertainty, and thinking through, is this a short-term thing or is this a long-term thing? And so those were the types of decisions, you know, we were wrestling with. And then I think, you know, as time went on, realizing this is not a short-term thing, this is very much a long-term reality. And so starting to think through what are the longer-term implications for that, for Davita, for our social responsibility as well. That's really when we shifted from more of the immediate response mode into, gosh, how can we incorporate some of these aspects, especially as it relates to racial justice, into our strategy? So how are we thinking about social responsibility differently based on current events that are not going away next week? And so then for me and our team, it was thinking through, you know, we have a really diverse teammate population, and it gets less diverse as you go up the ranks. So looking at that as one thing, looking at, we serve a really diverse population of teammates. And so what are we uniquely positioned to do to serve the communities, and how can we incorporate our volunteerism and our giving efforts in a way that's going to focus on access to healthcare or something that connects to what we do? And we've kind of done little bits of this here and there. And to me, this is the time to, hey, if we really want to make a difference, here's how we can do so. And it's connecting all of these little dots and little programs into maybe a smaller number of efforts, but that we could do those things really well. So that's how we're approaching it, and having those conversations with senior leaders on, hey, Davita, I'm so thankful. Davita has always done so much good for patients, each other, and world, because it is kind of baked into the DNA. It's part of the culture. That's one of the things that attracted me to Davita, because of that kind of philosophy and based in mission and values. And, you know, how can we do that a little bit more strategically to meet some real needs in the community and for our teammates and our patients as well? So those are the types of things that we are working on. So shifting from that short-term response perspective to, let's build this into our strategy moving forward.
And Demesha, can you speak to, similarly at your company, how are you guys thinking about the short term and the long term? And again, I know you said that for you, it's a matter of raising your voice and louder and being heard more, but are there specific ways you're actually doing that?
Yeah, so I think from a short-term standpoint, we were really trying to address the immediate needs of what was happening, but those immediate needs really tied into our overall long-term strategy. And it was really interesting, especially if I'm looking at things from a CSR lens. A lot of our philanthropic giving was going to educational programs, primarily to students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And we've done a lot in investing in making sure that teachers understand the cultural differences among their students so that they were teaching from an unbiased place. And so we did all of this years before, any of the unrest and COVID and all of that actually occurred. So it was really important for me to start to connect those dots with our various stakeholders within the business so that they can see that, you know, we've been doing this for a while, and yes, we're going to address the short-term needs, but this still ties into our overall long-term strategy of who we are as a company that really invests in our community. I feel that as far as amplifying the voice, I think people want to hear it now. They want to hear what we are doing. Before, people were sometimes in their own silos and they say, hey, I work in compliance, and you know, it doesn't really matter. That seems like that might be an HR initiative or community relations initiative. But I think people are willing to listen now. And so I think the fact that they're willing to listen now, the voices and my voice and voices of others are starting to be heard, which is really, really good. And then I also feel like our leadership team within the organization has now a heightened sensitivity to look at things from kind of an inclusivity lens when they're making their decisions. Sometimes they might make decisions in a bubble or in a vacuum, and now they're starting to look at the various stakeholders. Is this a win for the individual? Is this a win for the department, a win for the company, as well as is it a win for the community if that's applicable? And so I think they're starting to look at things through that lens to help guide some of their decision-making processes.
That's really interesting. I know I just put up a note. If anyone does have a question, we have a few minutes that I can take a question from the group. Please throw it in the chat. I'll tell you the thing that's on my mind for each of you is, what is your hope for the future of work? There's an opportunity in the midst of crisis. We all recognize that. And not to diminish the pain and agony and real problems that are facing a lot of people in our communities these days. But if there's something good that can come out of this for work, what would it be?
For me, I think one of the good things that could actually come out of this is the fact that people start to understand that we are all interconnected. So a policy that you might pass here in the city or county, I live in Henderson, Colorado. So what you might pass here in Henderson, Colorado is directly going to impact certain segments of our community. And you need to look at things from a long-term perspective. And I think that's how we are in some of these systematic challenges that we have. People say the systems are broken, but the systems aren't broken. The systems are designed to work the way that they were designed to work. And so we need to be educating ourselves on those policies and things that we're passing to make sure that we're designing a system that works for everyone.
Yeah, I would add on to that. I agree 100%. There is an idea in the American Indian community, which is very simply that all decisions are made with 7 generations out in mind. And that was profound to me, that level of future forethinking and empathy that far into the future. But I think that there's a real lesson there in terms of, especially for the US, we are very much about instant gratification and the big risk, big reward, what can I get today? And we need to start recognizing, my hope is that more and more businesses will begin to recognize the responsibility that falls to each and every one of us as individuals, as well as organizations, communities, what have you, that in today's globalization, what happens to one happens to all. And so we can't think of ourselves as unique individuals. None of us exists in a vacuum. The other thing that I would also say, my hope is that more and more companies, industries will share information. You know, we all need to be doing environmental scanning much more heavily than we are, But at the same time, we need to be able to share the information that we have and trust it so that we can make the most informed, educated decisions going forward.
Before Merna and Rachel answer my question, I want to jump in with a question that came in through the chat for Demesha. And then I'll give Merna and Rachel a chance to respond to my other question. But Angie Rodell, who was a CCSR alumni and is a CSR manager at Empower Retirement. And she is curious, Demesha, if you can elaborate on successful virtual volunteering and engagement, what that looks like.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I'll share with you. One of the virtual volunteering experiences that we shared with our employees was recording learning curriculum for junior achievement. So with all the kids at home, junior achievement is known for financial literacy and preparing students to actually become entrepreneurs. So they asked us to actually record content, whether it's on how to create a business plan, how to look at things from a marketing standpoint. So it was something easy that our employees could actually do at their homes, and it was something that was available globally. The other thing that we started to do is we understood that with all of this, our community partners were suffering. So we continued to commit to those community partners that we already committed to, but we did more with fundraising. So we did a 2.6 challenge where we just encouraged employees to do something for 26 minutes or do it 26 times. So some people did 26 push-ups, others ran 26 miles, and they raised money for a charity of their choice around the world, and we actually matched those contributions. So that was another opportunity. And then we created a platform for our employees to actually submit fundraising requests that they hear about in their community. So for example, we just received a fundraising request for an organization called Back on My Feet. They work with homeless individuals, getting them transitioned back into society. They usually go out and they do these fun, interactive runs in the morning time. And they said, you know, we can't really do that right now, but what we really would need is some yoga mats. And so we had an employee actually submit a request for us to purchase yoga mats for this organization that will be used at the Denver Rescue Mission. So we're really kind of getting creative in the ways that we're trying to engage our employees, but also keep them connected to their local community. Another example of a fundraising event we did was a Peloton ride, or if you don't have a Peloton, just ride your bike during this time period, and we actually match contributions if we got to a certain number of riders.
Thank you. I'm going to read the one more question out of the chat, and then I'm going to ask Merna and Rachel to help us close out with their big picture thoughts. But this question comes from Angela Medora, and she, how are your companies thinking through supporting parents as they decide whether to send their kids back to school or keep them home? And as a mom of 4 children, this is a very personal question for me as well. Any thoughts?
As a mom of 2, also a super personal question, super interested in knowing the answer. And I think it's a huge challenge. We've provided additional backup care, and we know it's still a huge question that I don't have a great answer on that one.
Yeah, I think where we're pushing is just for maximum flexibility for our parents in the organization. Doesn't matter when the work gets done. It just, so it just matters that the work gets done. So maximum flexibility is what we've been pushing. Yeah.
And Merna, do you want to contribute your thoughts on what work is going to look like from here, your hopes?
I think a couple of things. I hope that the long-term effect is what I started with earlier about in our organizations, are we doing collective noticing and collective feeling and collective responding, and having conversations in which we are intentional about what is it we should be noticing right now. What are we supposed to be thinking about, and how can we be responding, but including as much of the organization in those conversations as we can. I think that when people experience those collective conversations and those opportunities to do collective noticing, they learn, they are willing to integrate it into practices. It becomes part of the DNA of the organization. And that's how we elevate some of these really important issues into the mindset of everyone in the organization. I think that on both the COVID situation and when we're thinking about social justice issues, we always run the risk of being overmanaged and underled. And leaders really have to communicate their intention. They need to frame the issues for people. They need to help people do sense making. And I think that there's just no more critical time right now than to do that.
Rachel, you get the last word. What is the feedback?
Thanks. Ooh. In terms of CSR and my hope for the future, I want a more just workplace. I hope that CSR continues to move from this nice to have into the need to have, and investors through the ESG lens are saying this is a need to have, and hey, by the way, we're going to keep you accountable with additional metrics and more standardizing how we report on these really good efforts. And so hopefully that increases the impact overall and gets to report out to a broader stakeholder group. I really believe that business can be a powerful force for good. And with the global events that we have seen this year, I think it's more important than ever.
Wonderful. I want to thank everybody again for joining us today. I know I learned a lot in this conversation. That was very interesting. I'm putting a link in the chat to a survey. I will also send this out in an email later today in case you don't get to it now, but we would love to get some feedback both on today's session, but also other topics or speakers that you might be interested in hearing from in the future. So please do take a minute to give us that, your thoughts. There is one more panel in this series. It is next Thursday, also at 2 o'clock, and it is specifically looking at justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion issues, and set our businesses up for success over the long term. I think a lot of companies are concerned with solving immediate crises, and the question, for example, of parents and how do we not leave working parents out of the conversation is looking further ahead. And so that's the kind of stuff we'll be talking about. So if you haven't already registered for that, please feel free to do so. The link is on the CSR website. And thank you very much to the panel. Really appreciate your time today, and to everybody who signed up and attended this event. Thank you. Stay well.